Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet corner of the wizarding world. The Great War has ended, the darkness has lifted, and yet, peace, as we shall discover, brings challenges of its own. Tonight, we follow two souls who fought beside the boy who lived, two hearts that found each other amid chaos, now navigating the strange, uncertain waters of a world made new. Let us settle in, breathe deeply, and journey together into the story of Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger as they discover that sometimes the hardest battles come after the war is won. The spring sun rose gently over the Burrow on the first day of May, 1998, casting golden light across the patchwork fields and the crooked, beloved walls of the Weasley home. The war was over. Voldemort had fallen. The wizarding world, battered and grieving, had begun the slow, painful work of putting itself back together, piece by fragile piece. Inside the Burrow's warm kitchen, where copper pots hung from the ceiling and the smell of Mrs. Weasley's cooking had comforted generations, Ron Weasley sat at the scarred wooden table, a cup of tea cooling between his hands, watching steam curl upward into nothing. He was 20 years old, though he felt much older. The boy who had feared spiders and lived in his brother's shadows seemed like a distant memory, someone from another lifetime. The war had carved away his youth, left him hollow in places and hardened in others. And yet, when Hermione Granger walked into the kitchen that morning, her hair still wild from sleep, her hand reaching automatically for his shoulder as she passed, he felt something in his chest unlock, something that remembered how to hope. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still rough with dreams. She poured herself tea from the pot that stayed perpetually warm by magic, a small household charm that had survived everything, even Fred's death, even the Battle of Hogwarts, even the impossible grief that had settled over this house like snow. "Morning," Ron replied, and their eyes met. And in that look was a conversation they'd had 100 times since the battle ended. "Are you all right?" "Not really." "Me neither. But we're here. We're alive. That has to count for something." Outside, the garden gnomes chittered in the vegetable patch. An owl swooped overhead, perhaps carrying news from the ministry, where every day brought new revelations of Death Eaters captured, collaborators exposed, families torn apart by choices made in fear or darkness. The wireless in the corner hummed with morning programming, Celestina Warbeck's voice crooning something cheerful that felt out of place in this world still learning how to smile again. Mrs. Weasley bustled in, her face drawn but determined, the way she'd looked every day since they'd buried Fred. She carried fresh bread that filled the kitchen with a scent of yeast and warmth, the simple magic of ordinary things continuing. "You two are up early," she observed, though her tone suggested she knew neither of them had slept particularly well. No one in this house slept well anymore. "Couldn't sleep," Hermione admitted, accepting a slice of bread with a grateful nod. "Too much on my mind." And there was so much, dear listener, so very much weighing on both their minds. The future stretched before them, vast and undefined, no longer shaped by horcruxes or prophecies or the desperate need to survive until tomorrow. They were free now, free to choose, free to become whoever they wished to be. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Ron had received his letter from the Auror office 3 days ago. They wanted him, despite his lack of NEWTs, despite his youth. The The war had proven him in ways no examination ever could. Harry had received the same letter, and Kingsley Shacklebolt himself had written, explaining that the Auror department needed people who had faced true darkness and hadn't flinched. They needed heroes, he'd said, and the word had made Ron's ears burn with embarrassment and something else, something that might have been pride. Hermione, meanwhile, had been approached by 3 different ministry departments. Magical law enforcement wanted her tactical mind. The Department of Magical Education wanted her to help rebuild the curriculum at Hogwarts. But it was the Department of Magical Law that had caught her attention, that had lit a fire in her eyes Ron recognized from all those years of SPEF, of fighting for what was right even when no one wanted to listen. "They're writing new legislation," she'd told him one night as they sat by the pond behind the burrow, their fingers intertwined, the stars bright overhead. New protections for Muggle-borns, new restrictions on dark artifacts, new definitions of what constitutes dark magic. Ron, they want to rebuild everything, make it better, make it fair. Her passion had been beautiful and a little frightening. Ron knew that tone, that determination. When Hermione set her mind to changing the world had better step aside or be changed, whether it liked it or not. But there was something else weighing on Ron's heart, something that pulled at him every time he walked past Fred's empty chair, every time he heard George's footsteps overhead, pacing in the room they'd shared since childhood, now occupied by only one. Weasley's wizard wheezes stood dark and shuttered on Diagon Alley. George hadn't been back since the funeral. Their mother had gone once, gathering some of George's clothes and personal effects, and she'd returned pale and shaking, unable to speak of what it felt like to stand in that shop full of laughter and chaos and see it silent, abandoned, holding its breath. Ron had suggested carefully that maybe George should sell it, that maybe it was too painful, too full of Fred's fingerprints and voice and brilliant, mad ideas. George had looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "It's all I have left of him, Ron. The shop, the dreams we built. I can't let it die too." But George couldn't go back alone. That much was clear. The shop was Fred and George, always had been, 2 parts of one whole. How did one half of a partnership continue when the other half was buried under a white headstone in the cemetery beyond the village? These were the thoughts that circled Ron's mind as he sat in the kitchen that May morning, watching Hermione spread jam on her bread, watching his mother try to be strong, watching the dust motes dance in sunlight that felt too bright for this house of grief. "I need to talk to you," Hermione said suddenly, setting down her bread. "Both of you, really. Mrs. Weasley, would you sit for a moment?" Molly Weasley sat, her hands automatically smoothing her apron, her face arranging itself into patient listening, the way mothers do when they sense important news coming. Hermione took a breath, and Ron saw her gathering courage, saw her preparing to say something that mattered. "I've accepted the position with the Department of Magical Law," she said. "I start Monday. They want me to work on the Muggle-born rights legislation, help draft new protections, new equality measures. It's everything I've wanted to fight for." "Oh, Hermione, that's wonderful." Molly's face brightened genuinely for the first time in weeks. "You'll be brilliant at it. You'll change everything." "I'll try," Hermione said, and her hand found Ron's under the table, squeezed tight. "But it means long hours, really long hours. They said I should expect to work late most nights, at least at first. There's so much to do, so much that needs fixing. Ron felt something tighten in his chest, but he squeezed back, supportive, proud, terrified. "You'll be amazing," he said, meaning it. "You'll actually make a difference." "What about you?" Hermione turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Have you decided about the Auror office?" And here it was, the conversation they'd been circling for days. Ron looked down at their joined hands, at the scars on both their palms from things they'd survived together. "I want to," he said slowly. "I do. But, George," Molly said softly, just the one word, but it contained multitudes. "He needs help," Ron continued, the words coming easier now that they'd started. "The shop, I mean. He can't do it alone, and Mum, it's killing him, having it sit there empty. Like Fred died twice, once in the battle, and again every day that shop stays dark." Hermione's grip tightened. "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking maybe I could do both," Ron said, the plan forming even as he spoke it. "Auror training is part-time at first, right? Mostly evenings and weekends. I could help George during the days, get the shop running again. Then once he's back on his feet, once he's found his rhythm, I could go full-time with the Aurors." "Ron," Molly's eyes filled with tears, the grateful kind. "You would do that for George?" "He's my brother," Ron said simply. "And Fred would have done it for any of us. You know he would." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the tick of the old clock on the wall, the one that had tracked all their locations through the war, that had spent too many hours with too many hands pointing to mortal peril. Now most of the hands pointed to home, except for the one that would never move again, that Molly had left pointing to Fred's smiling face because she couldn't bear to remove it. "It means we won't see much of each other," Hermione said carefully, and Ron heard the fear beneath her words. They'd been inseparable for so long, fighting and surviving and loving as one unit. The thought of separate paths, separate schedules, separate lives was strange and painful. "We'll make it work," Ron said, with more confidence than he felt. "You'll come home to the Burrow on weekends. I'll visit you in London when I can. We've survived worse than busy schedules, haven't we?" Hermione smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have," she agreed. "We've survived much worse." And they had, dear listener. These two had walked into darkness together, had faced death and despair, had destroyed pieces of the darkest soul the wizarding world had ever known. Surely they could handle a few conflicting calendars, a few missed dinners, a few nights apart. Surely love that had survived Horcruxes could survive anything. The days that followed moved with strange quickness, the way time does when you're rushing toward change you're not entirely ready for. Hermione prepared for her new position, reading every piece of magical legislation she could find, filling notebooks with ideas and proposals, her mind already racing ahead to the battles she would fight in committee rooms and the Wizengamot chamber. Ron watched her work with admiration and a growing sense that he was watching her step into something enormous, something that would consume her in the way only Hermione could be consumed when she found a cause worth fighting for. He went to see George on a Tuesday afternoon, apparating to the alley behind Weasley's wizard wheezes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't been here since before the battle, since Fred was alive and the shop was bright with enchanted fireworks and the sound of children's laughter. George answered the door to the upstairs flat, looking thin and haunted, his remaining ears standing out starkly now that he'd cut his hair short, unable to look at his reflection and see Fred's face looking back. "Ron," he said, surprise and something like relief crossing his features. "What are you doing here?" "Thought you could use some help," Ron replied, keeping his voice light. "I hear there's a joke shop around here that could use a hand." George's face did something complicated, cycling through denial and hope and grief and gratitude, all in the space of a heartbeat. "Ron, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Ron interrupted gently. "I want to. Let me help, George. Let me be here." And so it began, dear listener. Ron Weasley, who had never imagined himself a shopkeeper, who had dreamed of being an Auror since he was small, stepped into his brother's grief and said, "I'll carry this with you. You don't have to do this alone." On Hermione's first day at the ministry, Ron woke early to see her off. She stood in the Burrow's kitchen in formal robes, her hair tamed into something resembling professional, her face determined and nervous and beautiful. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like you're about to change the world," Ron said honestly, and kissed her, and watched her disappear into the flue with a whoosh of green flame. Then he apparated to Diagon Alley, to a dark shop full of memories and dust, and helped his brother remember how to breathe. That evening, Ron had his first Auror orientation meeting at the ministry. He sat in a room full of other young witches and wizards, many of them survivors of the war, all of them bearing scars both visible and hidden. Kingsley Shacklebolt himself addressed them, his deep voice filling the room with authority and kindness. "You've all proven yourselves in ways I hope you never have to prove yourselves again," Kingsley said. "Now we need you to help us build a better world, to track down the darkness that remains, to protect those who can't protect themselves. It won't be easy. Some of you will get hurt. All of you will be changed by this work, but you're needed. The wizarding world needs you." Ron thought of Fred, of all the people who hadn't survived to see this better world they'd fought for. He thought of Hermione, already fighting her own battles in offices and courtrooms. He thought of George, slowly sweeping the shop floor that afternoon, humming half of a song that used to be a duet. "I'm in," Ron said when they asked who would commit to the full training program. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." He got home to the Burrow near midnight, exhausted, his mind full of new information about tracking spells and defensive protocols. Hermione wasn't there. She'd sent an owl saying she'd be working late, that she'd discovered some old discriminatory laws that needed immediate attention, that she'd lost track of time. Ron ate cold dinner alone in the kitchen, the wireless playing softly in the background, and told himself this was fine. This was what they'd chosen. This was how they would change the world. But as he climbed the stairs to bed, passing the closed door to Fred's room, passing the door to George's empty room, he felt something like loneliness settling over him, something he hadn't felt in years, not since Hermione had held his hand and they'd decided to face everything together. "We'll make it work," he'd promised her, and Ron Weasley had never broken a promise to Hermione Granger. He only hoped the world would give them the chance to keep this one. The shop smelled wrong. That was Ron's first thought when he stepped through the door of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes on his first official day of helping George. It smelled of dust and stillness, of magic gone stale, of potential energy trapped and waiting. It didn't smell like Fred anymore. That particular combination of singed hair from experimental explosions, peppermint from the breath-freshening bonbons, and the sharp, bright scent of creativity made manifest. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced lazily in the air. Everywhere Ron looked, he saw Fred. The displays were still arranged in his brother's style, organized chaos that somehow made perfect sense. The you-know-poo constipation cure sat next to the why are you worrying, you should ask yourself why not anxiety antidote. The pygmy puff display case stood empty, the soft beds inside them waiting for creatures that hadn't been restocked in months. On the counter, a half-finished prototype sat exactly where Fred had left it the morning they'd all gone to fight at Hogwarts. A trick wand that was supposed to turn into a bouquet of flowers. But the enchantment had never been quite right, and now it would never be finished. George stood in the center of the shop floor, turning slowly in a circle, his eyes taking in everything and nothing. He'd been doing this when Ron arrived, just standing, just looking, as if seeing the shop for the first time, or perhaps the last. It's bigger than I remembered, George said quietly. Emptier. Ron understood. The shop had always felt full when Fred was in it, crowded with his personality even when there were no customers. Now the space yawned open, cathedral-like in its silence, every corner an echo chamber for the laughter that used to fill it. Where do we start? Ron asked, keeping his voice gentle, practical. George needed tasks, needed purpose, needed to remember that his hands knew how to create, even if his heart had forgotten how to hope. George blinked, seeming to surface from wherever his mind had gone. The inventory, I suppose. Need to see what we have left, what's still good, what's gone off. He moved toward the back room, his footsteps hollow on the wooden floor. Fred always handled the stock management. Said I was too impatient with it, always wanted to jump straight to making new products rather than counting what we already had. The back room was worse, somehow. Here were all the works in progress, the experiments and half-formed ideas that Fred and George had been developing. Cauldrons with dried residue from abandoned potions. Notebooks filled with Fred's handwriting. Quick, messy scrawls of inspiration. Sketches of products that would now never exist. A corkboard on the wall covered in notes, some in Fred's hand, some in George's. A visual conversation between two minds that had worked as one. Ron watched George pick up one of the notebooks, watched his brother's fingers trace over Fred's writing, watched the grief move across his face like weather. He had this idea, George said, softly, right before everything. A product that would let you experience your happiest memory whenever you wanted. Like a pensive, but portable, personal. He called them Euphoria Echoes. Said people would need them after the war. Said we'd all need help remembering how to be happy. Ron's throat tightened. That sounds brilliant. It was. He was. George set the notebook down carefully, reverently. They all were. All his ideas. Even the mad ones. Especially the mad ones. They worked in silence for a while, Ron taking inventory while George sorted through cauldrons and ingredients, his movements mechanical, automatic. The shop had systems, Ron discovered, elaborate organizational methods that made sense only if you understood how Fred and George's minds worked. The ingredient storage was arranged not alphabetically, but by color, and comedic potential. The finished products were shelved by how funny the twins found them, not by price or popularity. "We need to restock," Ron said eventually, looking at his growing list. "Most of the popular items are completely sold out. Portable swamp, nearly gone. Skiving snack boxes, down to 3 boxes. Decoy detonators, maybe a dozen left." George nodded, unsurprised. "We haven't made anything new since January, since I came back from—" He didn't finish the sentence. Since he'd come back from being on the run, from fighting, from the months when they'd all thought they might die at any moment, and kept living anyway, kept fighting anyway. "Can you still make them?" Ron asked carefully. "The products, I mean, without Fred," George finished, his voice flat. "I don't know, Ron. We always did it together. He'd have an idea, I'd refine it, or I'd start something, he'd finish it. Even our magic worked better together. Twin magic, people called it. Mum said we were doing synchronized spell work before we could properly talk." Ron remembered, vaguely, being very small and watching his older twin brothers make things float and explode and transform, their wands moving in perfect mirror harmony, their faces alight with identical glee. He remembered thinking they were the most magical people in the world, even more than Percy with his perfect grades, or Bill with his cool curse-breaking job. "Maybe that's true," Ron said. "Maybe your magic was stronger together. But George, you're still brilliant. You're still creative. Fred would hate seeing the shop like this. You know he would." George's jaw clenched. "Fred's not here to see it." "No," Ron agreed quietly. "But I am. And I'm rubbish at inventing things. You know that. Can't brew a decent potion to save my life. But I can help. I can measure ingredients, test products, man the shop while you work in the back. I can be—" He hesitated, knowing the next words would hurt, but needing to say them anyway. "I can be your second pair of hands. Not Fred's hands, but hands that are here, that want to help." George looked at him for a long moment, his eyes so like Fred's, so painfully like Fred's, searching Ron's face. Then something in him seemed to crack open, just slightly, just enough. "All right," he said. "All right, little brother, let's try." They started small with something simple, skiving snack boxes. George knew the recipe by heart, had made thousands of them over the years. He moved around the back room gathering ingredients, Bulbadox powder for the fainting fancies, dried billywig stings for the fever fudge, Allihotzi leaves for the nosebleed nougat. Ron watched, taking mental notes, trying to understand the process. George's hands moved with muscle memory, measuring and mixing, his wand conducting a complex symphony of heating and cooling spells. For a moment, as he worked, George's face lost some of its haunted quality. This was familiar. This was home. "Fred always did the puking pastilles," George said, stirring a cauldron of something that smelled disturbingly like vomit. "Said he had a stronger stomach for it, which was rubbish, really. I just let him do it because he enjoyed grossing people out more than I did." Ron smiled despite himself. "Remember when he tested the first batch on Percy?" "Percy was furious," George said, and there was the ghost of his old grin, brief as starlight. "Puked all over his head boy badge. Fred laughed so hard he couldn't breathe, said it was the best moment of his life." The memory hung in the air between them, precious and painful. George's smile faded, but he kept working, kept stirring, and Ron counted that as a victory. They worked through the morning, the shop gradually filling with the familiar smells of potion making and magic. George taught Ron the basics, how to chop shrivelfig roots so they release their essence properly, how to tell when a mixture was ready by the way the steam curled, how to test a product safely, or as safely as anything the twins created could be tested. The trick, George explained, carefully pouring purple liquid into small molds, is getting the balance right between the illness and the cure. Too much illness, and people actually get sick. Too much cure, and it doesn't work as an excuse. Fred spent months perfecting the ratios. How do you test them? Ron asked, watching the liquid harden into small orange squares. George's expression turned wry. Very carefully, and with a lot of trial and error. Fred and I used to test everything on ourselves first. Landed in St. Mungo's more than once. Mum nearly killed us. Ron could imagine it. 2 teenage boys, brilliant and reckless, poisoning themselves repeatedly in the name of comedy and commerce. It should have been tragic, but somehow it was pure Fred and George, pure devotion to the craft of controlled chaos. By noon, they had produced 50 skiving snack boxes, neatly packaged and ready for sale. George stared at them, and Ron saw surprise on his face, as if he hadn't quite believed he could still do this without his twin. We did it, Ron said, softly. We did, George agreed, and for a moment, his voice held something like wonder. They broke for lunch, conjuring sandwiches because neither of them had thought to bring food. They ate sitting on the shop floor, their backs against the counter, looking out at the displays and the dusty windows and Diagon Alley beyond, where people were beginning to venture out again, slowly reclaiming the streets that had been dangerous for so long. Tell me about the Auror training, George said suddenly. What's it like? Ron swallowed his mouthful of sandwich, considering. Intense. They're not messing around. Even though most of us fought in the war, they're training us properly, from the ground up. Tracking spells, defensive magic, magical lore, interrogation techniques. It's good, actually. Feels like we're building something, making sure the war actually meant something. And Hermione? George asked, his tone careful. How's the ministry treating her? Ron's expression clouded, slightly. She's working too hard. Surprised. She came home last night past midnight, completely exhausted, still talking about some archaic law from the 1600s that classifies Muggle-borns as magical anomalies that needs to be overturned. She's fighting the entire system, George, and you know Hermione. She won't stop until she wins. Sounds familiar, George said quietly. Fred was like that about the shop. Couldn't stop inventing, couldn't stop improving things, drove himself mad sometimes, trying to make everything perfect. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, an owl swooped past, carrying someone's post. A witch walked by with shopping bags from Flourish and Blots. Life was continuing, dear listener, as it always does, even when individual hearts are broken, even when the world feels like it should pause in respect for grief. Do you think it gets easier? George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Missing him? Ron considered lying, offering false comfort. But George deserved honesty. I don't know, he said. But I think maybe the missing becomes part of you, instead of being all of you, like you carry it, but it doesn't crush you anymore. At least, that's what Bill said about missing people from the war. George nodded slowly. I talk to him sometimes. Fred, I mean. When I'm working, tell him what I'm doing. Ask his opinion on things. Is that mad? No, Ron said firmly. I don't think that's mad at all. The afternoon passed more easily. They worked on restocking the display shelves, dusting and cleaning, making the shop look alive again. George opened the curtains wider, letting more light in, and the effect was transformative. Suddenly, the shop looked less like a mausoleum and more like a place of business, a place of possibility. Ron found himself enjoying the work, the simple physicality of it. After months of hunting Horcruxes, of constant fear and vigilance, there was something deeply satisfying about arranging pygmy puffs. George had found a supplier who could deliver tomorrow, and polishing display cases and organizing products by category. You're good at this, George observed, watching Ron create an eye-catching display of decoy detonators. The shop stuff, I mean, better than I expected. Don't sound so surprised, Ron said, grinning. I've been watching you and Fred my whole life. Some of it must have sunk in. Fred would have liked having you here, George said softly. He always said you were braver than you gave yourself credit for. Smarter, too. Ron's throat tightened. Yeah, well, Fred always saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. They worked until the sun began to set, painting Diagon Alley in shades of gold and amber. George stood at the window, looking out at the street, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow I think we should open, just for a few hours. See if anyone still remembers us, still wants what we're selling. Ron felt a surge of hope, of pride in his brother. You're ready for that? No, George said honestly. But I don't think I ever will be, so might as well do it anyway. That's what Fred would say. If you're going to fail, George, fail spectacularly. Ron smiled. Sounds like him. Everything sounds like him, George said quietly. The whole world sounds like him, when I'm listening right. They locked up the shop as the last light faded from the sky. George stood on the doorstep for a moment, looking back inside at what they'd accomplished. The clean displays, the restocked shelves, the small signs of life returning to a place that had seemed dead. Thank you, George said, not looking at Ron. For today, for being here, for understanding. Always, Ron said simply. That's what brothers do. They apparated separately, George to the flat above the shop, Ron back to the burrow. Ron arrived in the garden just as full darkness fell, the windows of his childhood home glowing warm and golden. Inside, he could hear his mother moving around the kitchen, could smell dinner cooking, could feel the pull of home and safety and love. But Hermione wasn't there. Another owl had arrived, this one saying she'd be working through the night, that there was a deadline for the new legislation proposal, that she was sorry, but this was important. Ron stood in the garden for a moment, looking up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. He thought of Hermione in some ministry office, surrounded by ancient law books and burning candles, fighting her own battles. He thought of George alone in the flat above the shop, probably talking to Fred's ghost, probably crying when no one could see. He thought of the Auror training session he had tomorrow evening, of the Death Eaters still at large, of the darkness that hadn't been entirely vanquished by Voldemort's fall. And he thought of the promise he'd made to help George to become an Auror, to support Hermione, to be enough for everyone who needed him. We'll make it work, he'd said. Looking up at the stars, Ron Weasley hoped he was right. The Wizengamot chamber was cold. Hermione Granger noticed this every morning when she entered through the heavy oak doors, her arms laden with files and proposals, her mind sharp and ready for battle. The ancient chamber, deep in the heart of the ministry, seemed designed to intimidate, high ceilings that made voices echo and diminish, tiered seats rising up like a tribunal, the bench where the chief warlock sat elevated above all others like a throne. The stone walls held centuries of magical lore, centuries of tradition, and most troublingly, centuries of prejudice, codified into legal language. She sat at the lower advocates' bench, the place reserved for junior staff and petitioners, and watched the Wizengamot members file in. Many of them were old families, pure-blood dynasties, who had survived the war by remaining carefully neutral or by claiming they'd been under the imperious curse. A few, a precious few, were genuine reformers who shared Kingsley Shacklebolt's vision of a new, fairer, magical Britain. But most were simply protecting the old order, the old ways, the old privileges that had existed for 1,000 years. "Miss Granger," intoned Tiberius Ogden, one of the more progressive members, his voice carefully neutral. "You wish to address the Assembly regarding Proposal 47B, the Magical Heritage Equality Act?" Hermione stood, smoothing her formal robes, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She was 20 years old, barely more than a child by Wizengamot standards, a Muggle-born witch proposing to overturn laws that predated her grandparents' grandparents. She could feel the hostility like a physical pressure, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who does she think she is? "Honored members of the Wizengamot," she began, her voice clear and strong, despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I come before you today to propose the abolition of 17 archaic laws that classify Muggle-born witches and wizards as legally inferior to their magical-born counterparts. These laws, some dating back to the 15th century, create a system of institutionalized discrimination that has no place in modern magical society." She could see the sneers forming, the dismissive glances exchanged between certain members. Cornelius Fudge, somehow still clinging to his position despite his disastrous tenure as minister, looked positively apoplectic. Dolores Umbridge, released from Azkaban on a technicality that still made Hermione's blood boil, sat in the upper tiers, her toad-like face arranged in false sweetness. "For example," Hermione continued, refusing to be cowed, "the Magical Anomaly Classification Act of 1692 still technically classifies Muggleborns as aberrations of natural magical order and grants the Ministry the right to monitor our magical development for the safety of the wizarding community. The Pure Blood Priority Employment Act of 1754 legally permits employers to favor pure-blood applicants over equally qualified Muggle-borns. And the Heritage Verification Statute of 1811 requires Muggle-born children to undergo magical heritage testing that pure-blood children are exempt from. These laws were created in different times," interrupted Griselda Marchbanks, her ancient voice quavering with indignation. "They reflect the concerns and customs of their eras. One cannot simply sweep away centuries of legal precedent because modern sensibilities find them uncomfortable." "With respect, Madam Marchbanks," Hermione replied, her tone respectful but firm. "These laws were created to oppress and discriminate. They were wrong when they were written, and they remain wrong today. The recent war proved that magical ability has nothing to do with blood status. Some of our most powerful witches and wizards are Muggle-born. Some of our darkest villains were pure blood. How dare you, someone hissed from the upper tiers. Hermione couldn't identify the speaker, but the sentiment was clear. I dare, Hermione said quietly, because I am one of the people these laws were designed to diminish, because I fought in a war to end blood supremacy, and I will not stand by while the legal system perpetuates the very ideology we defeated on the battlefield. The chamber erupted into argument, voices rising and falling like storm waves. Kingsley Shacklebolt, presiding from the chief warlock's seat, called for order, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. Miss Granger's proposal will be reviewed by committee, he announced. We will reconvene in 1 week to debate its merits. This session is adjourned. Hermione gathered her papers with trembling hands, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Small victories, she reminded herself. Getting the proposal to committee was progress. But as she left the chamber, she heard the whispers following her. Mudblood, upstart, thinks she can change everything, and felt the familiar sting of prejudice that no war could fully erase. She worked through lunch at her desk, a cramped space in the Department of Magical Law that she shared with 2 other junior advocates. Her quill scratched across parchment as she drafted supplementary arguments, gathered precedents from other magical governments, built her case brick by brick, word by word. The work was endless, exhausting, exhilarating. Every law she read revealed another injustice, another system designed to favor the privileged, another wrong that needed righting. You're going to burn out, said Marcus Whitby, one of her colleagues, appearing at her desk with tea that had long gone cold. Hermione, it's 4 in the afternoon. You've been here since 6 this morning. Have you eaten? I'll eat later, Hermione murmured, not looking up from her notes. I need to finish this analysis of the 1811 statute. The committee meeting is in 3 days, and I need to be ready for every possible objection. The committee meeting can wait 3 hours while you take care of yourself, Marcus said gently. He was older, 40-something, a half-blood wizard who'd been advocating for reform for years with limited success. He'd become something of a mentor to Hermione, teaching her the political realities of magical law while admiring her passionate idealism. 3 hours is 3 hours I could be working, Hermione replied, but she did accept the tea, sipping it absently. And 3 hours of rest is 3 hours you could be sharp and effective instead of exhausted and making mistakes, Marcus countered. This is a marathon, Hermione, not a sprint. Pace yourself, or you won't make it to the finish line. But Hermione couldn't pace herself, dear listener. It wasn't in her nature. She'd spent her entire life fighting to prove herself, to earn her place in a world that had tried to tell her she didn't belong. And now, finally, she had the power to change that world, to make it better for every Muggle-born child who had come after her. How could she rest when there was so much work to be done? Meanwhile, across London in the shadowed streets of Nocturne Alley, Ron Weasley crouched in the darkness, his wand drawn, his breathing controlled and silent. He'd been on patrol for 3 hours, following a tip about Death Eater sympathizers using an abandoned shop as a meeting place. Beside him, Harry Potter waited with the same tense readiness, and behind them, 3 other trainee Aurors watched the building's back entrance. Anything, whispered Williamson, their supervising Auror, a grizzled veteran who'd been tracking dark wizards since before Ron was born. Nothing yet, Ron breathed back. But the wards are definitely active. Someone's using dark magic in there. I can feel it. He could too. The war had left him sensitive to dark magic in ways he'd never been before. Too many months hunting, Horcruxes, too many encounters with cursed objects and corrupted spells. It left a residue on your magical senses, a crawling feeling on the back of your neck when darkness was near. Could be a false alarm, Williamson muttered. Could be someone brewing illegal potions. Could be... The door exploded outward in a blast of purple light. Ron threw up a shield charm on instinct, feeling the impact shudder through his magical core. 3 figures in dark robes burst from the building, wands blazing, and suddenly the alley was chaos. Jets of light crisscrossing in the darkness, the crack of apparition as more Aurors arrived, shouts and curses, and the acrid smell of destructive magic. Ron moved on pure training and experience, his body remembering every duel he'd fought, every battle he'd survived. Stupefy, Expelliarmus, Protego. The spells flowed from his wand like water, precise and powerful. One of the dark-robed figures went down, another's wand went flying, and then there was a burst of green light, Avada Kedavra. Ron dove sideways, feeling the killing curse pass so close that his hair stirred in its wake. His heart hammered against his ribs, terror and fury mixing into something cold and focused. These weren't just sympathizers. These were actual Death Eaters, willing to kill, willing to die rather than be captured. Incarcerus! Harry's voice rang out, and ropes shot from his wand, binding 2 of the fleeing figures. Ron scrambled to his feet, chasing the 3rd down the alley, his longer legs eating up the distance. He could hear the Death Eaters' ragged breathing, could see them raising their wand to disapparate. Stupefy! Ron roared, and the spell hit home. The figure crumpled, unconscious before they hit the cobblestones. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by heavy breathing and the groan of one of the captured Death Eaters. Ron stood over his prisoner, wand steady, and felt the familiar mixture of triumph and horror that came with violence. They'd won. They'd captured 3 dangerous criminals. And he'd nearly died. Again. Just like in the war. Just like always. Good work, Weasley, Williamson said, appearing at his shoulder. That was textbook pursuit and capture. Ron nodded, not trusting his voice. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. They processed the prisoners at the ministry, filling out endless paperwork, giving statements, securing the dark artifacts that had been found in the abandoned shop. By the time Ron was released, it was past midnight. He was dirty, bruised from his dive onto the cobblestones, and so tired he could barely think straight. He apparated to the burrow, stumbling slightly as he materialized in the garden. The house was dark, except for one window, his mother's room. She always waited up when she knew he was on patrol, unable to sleep until she knew he was safe. It broke his heart a little, this new fear she carried, this knowledge that her children were still in danger even though the war was supposedly over. Inside, he found a note on the kitchen table in Hermione's neat handwriting. Working late again. Don't wait up. Love you. Ron stared at the note for a long moment, feeling something twist in his chest. They'd barely seen each other in 2 weeks. Ships passing in the night, his mum had said sadly. Both fighting their own battles, both too exhausted to fight for their relationship with the same intensity. He trudged upstairs, past Fred's closed door, past George's empty room. His brother stayed at the shop flat most nights now, to his own small bedroom. He collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, his wand still clenched in his hand, and stared at the ceiling where stars still glowed from the constellation charm Hermione had cast years ago, when they'd all been younger and the future had seemed bright and uncomplicated. The next morning, George's shop officially reopened. Ron had promised to be there for the grand reopening, but between his late-night patrol and another Auror training session at dawn, he could only manage a brief visit in the afternoon. He apparated to Diagon Alley and felt his heart lift at what he saw. The shop windows gleamed, displaying new products in eye-catching arrangements. A banner hung over the door. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, now reopened. Still Weasley, still wizard, still wheezing. A small crowd had gathered outside, mostly parents with children, people who remembered the shop from before, people brave enough to venture back into Diagon Alley now that it was safe again. Inside was controlled chaos. George stood behind the counter, demonstrating a decoy detonator to a fascinated group of 11-year-olds, while simultaneously ringing up purchases and answering questions about product safety. He looked tired, thinner than he should be, but there was something in his face that Ron hadn't seen in months. A spark, a hint of the old George shining through the grief. "Ron!" George called out, spotting him. "Perfect timing. I need someone to demonstrate the portable swamp in the back room. Think you can handle it?" "Handle creating a swamp?" Ron grinned. "I think I can manage." He spent 2 hours at the shop, helping with customers, restocking shelves, watching George slowly remember how to be the showman, the entertainer, the brilliant inventor who'd always been half of Fred and George. It wasn't the same, of course. It would never be the same. But it was something. It was forward motion. It was life, continuing. "How's business?" Ron asked during a brief lull, restocking the skiving snack box display. "Better than expected," George admitted, his tone surprised. "People want to laugh again, Ron. Want to remember what it felt like before everything went dark. And apparently, we're the place they come for that." He paused, his expression growing complicated. "Sometimes, I forget when I'm working. Forget that Fred's gone. I'll turn to ask him something, or I'll hear his voice in my head telling me how to improve a product. And for a moment, it's like he's still here. Is that healthy, do you think?" "I think," Ron said carefully, "that Fred will always be here, in this shop, in everything you create. And maybe that's not forgetting. Maybe that's just keeping him alive in the ways that matter." George's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "When did you get so wise, little brother?" "Probably around the time I helped destroy bits of Voldemort's soul," Ron said lightly. "Tends to give you perspective." They shared a smile, brief but genuine, and Ron felt something warm in his chest. This was working. Against all odds, against grief and trauma and exhaustion, this was actually working. But later that evening, at Auror training, Ron learned about the next mission, a raid on a suspected Death Eater safe house in Wales, scheduled for the following week. "High risk," Williamson said. "Possible casualties. All volunteers." Ron's hand went up immediately, along with Harry's. And across London, in a ministry office lit by candlelight and determination, Hermione Granger drafted yet another proposal, fighting yet another battle. her eyes burning with exhaustion and purpose. They would see each other on Sunday, they'd promised. A whole day together, at the Burrow, just the two of them. But Sunday was 6 days away, and so much could happen in 6 days. So very much could happen in the space between promises. The rain fell softly on the window panes of Hermione's tiny ministry office, each drop a whisper against the glass, a gentle percussion to accompany her furious scribbling. It was Thursday evening, 9:30, and most of the ministry had emptied hours ago. But Hermione sat hunched over her desk, surrounded by towering stacks of legal texts, her quill moving with fierce precision across fresh parchment. The Heritage Verification Statute of 1811 lay open before her, its archaic language mocking her with its casual cruelty. Muggle-born children shall submit to mandatory heritage testing to verify absence of squib ancestry or fraudulent magical manifestation. She'd found something. After 3 days of research that had stolen her sleep and consumed her meals, she'd found a precedent from 1823 that contradicted the very foundation of the statute. A case involving a pure-blood family whose child had been tested under similar circumstances, and the Wizengamot of that era had ruled such testing an invasion of family privacy and magical autonomy. If testing purebloods was an invasion of privacy, then legally, testing Muggle-borns should be as well. It was brilliant. It was perfect. It was exactly the ammunition she needed for next week's committee hearing. And Ron had no idea, because Ron was somewhere in Wales on a dangerous raid, and Hermione had no one to tell. She set down her quill, rubbing her tired eyes, and felt the loneliness settle over her like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. When had this become her life? When had she traded the warmth of Ron's presence for the cold comfort of legal victories? When had they last had a real conversation, longer than 10 minutes, that wasn't about schedules or apologies or promises to do better? Sunday. They'd promised each other, Sunday, 3 days ago. A whole day together at the Burrow. No work, no missions, just them. But Ron's raid had been moved to Saturday night, and he'd sent an owl that morning, exhausted, apologetic, asking if they could postpone to next Sunday instead. Hermione had sent back a single word. Fine. But it wasn't fine, dear listener. Nothing was fine. And the worst part was that Hermione understood. She understood duty, understood the importance of Ron's work, understood that hunting Death Eaters couldn't wait for convenient timing. Just as she expected Ron to understand her work, her mission to rebuild the legal foundations of their world. But understanding didn't ease the ache of missing him. Understanding didn't warm the cold bed she'd been sleeping in at her tiny London flat, the one-room space she'd rented because commuting from the Burrow added 2 hours to already impossible days. Still here, Granger? Hermione looked up to find Marcus Whitby in her doorway, his coat damp from rain, a concerned expression on his weathered face. You know the ministry actually closes at 6, don't you? It's optional for you to live here. I found something, Hermione said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice despite her exhaustion. Marcus, I found a precedent that could overturn the Heritage Verification Statute. From 1823, a case involving the Greengrass family. Hermione, Marcus interrupted gently, stepping into her office. It's after 10 at night. You've been here since before dawn. Whatever you found, it'll still be there tomorrow. But the hearing is Monday, Hermione protested. I need to prepare, cross-reference, build the argument. You need to sleep. Marcus said firmly. You need to eat something that isn't tea and adrenaline. You need to remember that you're human, not a legal brief writing machine. He paused, his tone softening. When did you last see Ron? The question hit harder than any Wizengamot member's hostility. Hermione felt her eyes burn with sudden, unwelcome tears. 2 weeks ago, for breakfast. We had 30 minutes before he had to leave for Auror training. That's not sustainable, Marcus said quietly. I know, Hermione whispered. I know it's not. But what am I supposed to do? Give up? Let these discriminatory laws stand because my personal life is suffering? People's lives are affected by this work, Marcus. Muggle-born children are still being treated as second-class citizens because I haven't fought hard enough, haven't worked long enough. Stop, Marcus said, his voice kind but firm. You're not Atlas, Hermione. You're not holding up the entire world by yourself. The fight for justice doesn't require you to sacrifice everything, including your own happiness and health. He sat down in the chair opposite her desk. Can I tell you something? Something I learned the hard way. Hermione nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I used to be just like you, Marcus said. 20 years ago, fresh out of Hogwarts, burning with righteous fury about all the injustices in magical law. I worked every hour, fought every battle, alienated everyone who tried to tell me to slow down. And you know what happened? I burned out. Completely. Spent 6 months unable to even look at a law book without feeling sick. And in those 6 months, all my cases stalled, all my progress stopped. Because I hadn't built a foundation that could sustain itself. I'd built everything on my own exhaustion. What did you do? Hermione asked softly. I learned to pace myself. I learned that systemic change is a marathon, not a sprint. I learned that taking care of myself and my relationships wasn't selfish. It was essential. Because if I destroyed myself in the pursuit of justice, I couldn't help anyone. He leaned forward. Go home, Hermione. See Ron. Rest. The work will be here Monday. You'll be more effective if you're not running on fumes. Hermione looked at her desk, at the precedent she'd found, at all the work still undone. Then she looked at Marcus's kind, knowing face. You're right, she said quietly. I know you're right. I don't know how to stop. Practice, Marcus said simply. Start small. Go home tonight. Sleep. See Ron when he gets back from Wales. Then come back Monday with a clear head and fight like hell. But fight from a place of strength, not exhaustion. After Marcus left, Hermione sat for a long moment in the quiet office, listening to the rain, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. She carefully organized her notes, filed the precedent she'd found, and put on her coat. The rain was cold on her face as she stepped out into the London night, but it felt almost cleansing, washing away some of the tension she'd been carrying. She apparated to her flat, a tiny space above a Muggle bookshop in Camden. As she climbed the stairs, she heard her enchanted wireless playing softly. She always left it on, unable to bear coming home to complete silence. Inside, her cat Crookshanks wound around her ankles, purring, the only living thing that regularly welcomed her home. I know, I'm sorry, Hermione murmured, scratching behind his ears. I'm a terrible cat mother. I'm a terrible girlfriend. I'm apparently trying to be terrible at everything except work. Crookshanks, being a cat, had no opinion on this self-assessment. He simply led her to his food bowl with pointed determination. After feeding him, Hermione stood in her small kitchen, looking at the cold leftovers in her icebox, and made a decision. She pulled out parchment and wrote a letter. Ron, I know you're on a mission, and I know Sunday is complicated now. But when you get back, whenever you get back, I need to see you. Really see you, not just pass each other like ghosts in the Burrow's kitchen. I miss you. I miss us. I miss knowing what you're thinking, what makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night. I miss being part of your life instead of just a name in your schedule. Please, when this mission is done, can we find time? Real time. I love you. I'm sorry I've been so absent. I'm sorry I've let the work consume me. I'm trying to do better. Always yours, Hermione. She sent the letter with her ministry owl, watching it disappear into the rainy night, carrying her heart across the miles to wherever Ron was. Meanwhile, in a forest in Wales, Ron Weasley crouched behind an ancient oak tree, his wand drawn, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. The Death Eater safe house loomed ahead, a cottage that looked innocent enough from the outside, but the wards surrounding it practically screamed dark magic. Beside him, Harry checked his sneakerscope one more time, while behind them, 6 other Aurors waited for Williamson's signal. The raid had been planned for days. Intelligence suggested 3, maybe 4 Death Eaters were using the cottage as a base, coordinating with remnant cells across Britain, planning something. The details were murky, but the threat was real enough to mobilize a full Auror team. Remember, Williamson whispered, his grizzled face barely visible in the darkness. We want them alive if possible. Dead Death Eaters can't tell us about their networks. But don't hesitate if it comes down to them, or you. Your lives matter more than their intelligence. Ron felt the familiar pre-battle tension settling into his muscles, the strange clarity that came with danger. This was so different from the war, and yet exactly the same. The fear was identical. The determination was identical. The knowledge that he might not survive the next hour was absolutely, terrifyingly identical. But there was something else too. A thought that hadn't been there during the war, when survival itself had seemed like an impossible dream. Now, Ron had things to lose. He had a future with Hermione, had promised George he'd help at the shop tomorrow, had plans and hopes and a life that was just beginning. The thought of Hermione made his chest tighten. He'd sent her that apologetic note about postponing Sunday, and her single-word response had felt like a door closing. Fine, but it wasn't fine. He knew it wasn't fine. They were drifting apart, slowly but surely, pulled by tides of duty and exhaustion, and the simple, brutal fact that there weren't enough hours in the day to do everything they needed to do and still be present for each other. Weasley, Williamson hissed. You with us? Ron shook himself, focusing. Yeah, sorry. Ready. Good. Because we're going in 3, 2, 1. Now. The Aurors moved as one, wands raised, shield charms already forming as they approached the cottage. Ron felt the wards resist them, dark magic pushing back against their presence like an invisible wall. Williamson dispelled them with a complex countercurse that made the air shimmer and crack. And then they were through, bursting through the front door. Chaos. The cottage's interior was larger than it should be, magically expanded and filled with dark artifacts that pulsed with malevolent energy. 4 robed figures spun to face them, wands already blazing. The air filled with curses, Crucio, Avada Kedavra, Sectum Sempra. spells meant to torture and kill. No hesitation, no mercy. Ron dove behind an overturned table, firing stunning spells over the top. Beside him, Harry was dueling 2 Death Eaters at once, his movements fluid and deadly efficient. Every lesson from the war burned into muscle memory. Another Auror went down, hit by a curse Ron didn't recognize, their scream cutting through the chaos. "Incendio!" One of the Death Eaters roared, and suddenly the cottage was on fire. Flames licking up the walls with unnatural speed, magical fire that couldn't be easily extinguished. "Fall back," Williamson ordered. "Get out, regroup outside." Ron started to retreat, providing cover fire for the injured Auror when he saw it. One of the Death Eaters raising their wand, aiming not at Ron, but at Harry's back. Harry, who was focused on the enemy in front of him, who wouldn't see the curse coming. Ron moved without thinking, throwing himself between Harry and the Death Eater, his shield charm forming even as the words left his lips. "Protego." The curse hit his shield with the force of a physical blow, and Ron felt his magical core strain under the impact. His shield held barely, the spell deflecting upward into the burning ceiling. But the effort left him exposed, and a second Death Eater saw the opening. "Divindo!" they shrieked, and Ron felt the slicing curse catch his left side, cutting through robes and flesh with white-hot agony. He went down hard, his wand clattering from nerveless fingers, blood already soaking through his robes. The pain was extraordinary, stealing his breath, turning his vision white at the edges. He heard Harry shouting, heard the crack of more curses, heard Williamson ordering a full retreat, but it all sounded distant, muffled, like he was underwater. Strong hands grabbed him, Harry's hands, dragging him toward the door. Ron tried to help, tried to get his feet under him, but his left side was screaming and wet and wrong. Outside, in the cold Welsh air, someone was pressing wands to his wound, muttering healing charms, but the blood kept coming. "Stay with me," Harry was saying, his voice tight with fear. "Ron, stay with me. Don't you dare—" Fine," Ron managed, though he definitely wasn't fine. The world was tilting sideways, and he could feel himself slipping toward unconsciousness, toward darkness that had nothing to do with Death Eaters. The last thing he remembered before the darkness took him was thinking about Hermione's letter, the one he'd received that morning but hadn't had time to properly read. Something about missing him, about needing to see him. And Ron thought, with crystal clarity, even as consciousness faded, "I should have made time. I should have always made time." Then the darkness came, gentle and absolute, and Ron Weasley knew nothing more. The emergency flue at the burrow roared to life at 3 a.m, green flames erupting with an urgency that sent sparks across the kitchen floor. Molly Weasley, who had been dozing fitfully in her chair by the dying fire, she never slept well when her children were on missions, bolted upright, her heart already knowing, the way mothers' hearts always know when their children are in danger. Harry Potter stumbled through, his robes torn and blood-stained, his face pale beneath the soot and grime. "Mrs. Weasley," he said, his voice hoarse, and the fear in it made Molly's blood run cold. "It's Ron. There was a raid. He was hit. He's at St. Mungo's." Molly didn't wait to hear more. She was already moving, shouting for Arthur, grabbing her emergency medical bag that she'd kept packed since the war, her hands shaking as she threw flu powder into the flames. "St. Mungo's," she cried, and stepped into the green fire. her mind already spiraling through terrible possibilities, her heart already breaking. The hospital's emergency receiving area was controlled chaos. Healers in lime green robes rushing between beds, the smell of blood and healing potions thick in the air, the moans of the injured creating a symphony of suffering. Molly pushed through, her eyes scanning desperately until she found him. Ron lay on a bed in the corner, surrounded by 3 healers working with focused intensity. His robes had been cut away, revealing a long, vicious gash along his left side, the flesh laid open in a way that made Molly's stomach turn. Blood soaked the sheets beneath him, despite the healer's best efforts. And his face, her baby's face, was pale as death, his freckles standing out like ink stains on parchment. "How bad?" Molly demanded, her voice sharp with terror masquerading as authority. Years of raising 7 children had taught her that panic helped no one, that she could fall apart later, that right now she needed to be strong. The curse was a modified Diffindo, one of the healers said, without looking up, her wands moving in complex patterns over Ron's wound. Deeper than standard cutting curses, and it's resisting healing. We're having to knit the tissue layer by layer. He's lost a lot of blood. Arthur arrived then, breathless from the flu, and Molly felt his hand find hers, felt him trembling just as badly as she was. They stood together, watching their son fight for his life on a healer's table, and the helplessness was worse than any curse. "He saved Harry's life," came a quiet voice behind them. They turned to find Williamson, the senior Auror, looking exhausted and grim. Death Eater was about to hit Harry with a killing curse. Ron threw himself in the way, took a cutting curse instead. If he hadn't, Williamson's jaw clenched. We'd be having a very different conversation right now. Of course he had, Molly thought, with a mixture of pride and anguish. Of course, her son had thrown himself in front of a curse meant for his best friend. That was who Ron was, who he'd always been, loyal to the point of stupidity, brave to the point of recklessness, willing to die for the people he loved, just like Fred had been. The thought sent ice through Molly's veins. No, not again. She couldn't lose another son. She wouldn't survive it. "Where's Hermione?" Arthur asked suddenly, looking around. Has anyone told Hermione? Harry paled further, if that was possible. I sent an owl to her flat, but I don't know if she's there. She works late most nights. "I'll go," Molly said immediately. She couldn't stand here watching, couldn't bear the helplessness. At least finding Hermione was something she could do, some way she could help. "Arthur, stay with him. I'll bring her back." The Ministry of Magic at 3 a.m. was eerily quiet. The usual bustle replaced by the soft footsteps of night security and the distant hum of enchanted maintenance. Molly hurried through the atrium, past the Fountain of Magical Brethren, toward the Department of Magical Law. She'd been here once before, bringing Hermione lunch when the girl had been too consumed by work to eat, and she remembered the way. The office was lit, a single lamp burning against the darkness. Hermione sat at her desk, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her quill moving across parchment with mechanical precision. She didn't look up when Molly entered, too focused on whatever legal argument she was crafting. "Hermione," Molly said gently. Hermione's head snapped up, surprise and confusion crossing her face. "Mrs. Weasley, what are you doing here? Is everything—" Then she saw Molly's expression, saw the tear tracks on the older woman's face, and the color drained from her own. "No," she whispered. "No, please, not Ron. Please tell me." "He's alive," Molly said quickly, crossing to her. "He's alive, but he's hurt. St. Mungo's. You need to come now." Hermione was already moving, abandoning her work without a second glance, her hands shaking as she grabbed her coat. "How bad? What happened?" "Cutting curse. Deep. They're working on him now." Molly took Hermione's arm, steadying her. "He saved Harry's life, dear. Threw himself in front of a curse." Hermione made a sound like a wounded animal, pain and pride and terror all mixed together. "Of course he did," she said, her voice breaking. "Of course he did. The brave, stupid, wonderful—" She couldn't finish, tears streaming down her face. They flew back to St. Mungo's together, Hermione stumbling slightly as they emerged, Molly catching her, both of them hurrying toward the emergency ward. Ron was still on the table, still surrounded by healers, but something had changed. The frantic energy had calmed slightly, the lead healer stepping back with an expression of cautious relief. "We've stabilized him," she announced. "The bleeding is under control, and we've repaired most of the deep tissue damage. He'll need to stay for observation, and there may be some permanent scarring, but barring complications, he should make a full recovery." The relief that flooded through Molly was so intense it made her dizzy. Arthur caught her, and they held each other, crying quietly, releasing the terror they'd been holding at bay. But Hermione stood frozen, staring at Ron's pale, unconscious face, her expression devastated. "Can I—" Her voice came out as a whisper. "Can I sit with him?" "Of course, dear," the healer said gently. "We're moving him to a private room. You can stay as long as you like." They moved Ron to a quiet room on the 4th floor, the one reserved for Auror injuries. Hermione pulled a chair to his bedside and took his hand, the one that wasn't wrapped in bandages, and simply held it, her tears falling silently onto their joined fingers. The Weasley family arrived in waves as dawn broke over London. George came first, still in his pajamas, his face stricken. Bill and Fleur arrived from Shell Cottage. Charlie flew in from Romania. Percy came from his flat, for once not concerned with propriety or work schedules. Ginny arrived with Harry, her eyes red from crying. They filled the small room with Weasley chaos. Too many people, too much emotion, too much love contained in too small a space. But no one wanted to leave. No one wanted to be anywhere but here, surrounding Ron with the fierce protective energy of family. "He's going to be fine," George said, sitting on Ron's other side, his voice firm as if he could make it true through sheer determination. "He's too stubborn to be anything else. Survived a war, survived Voldemort, survived being my guinea pig for product testing. A cutting curse isn't going to take him out." Hermione squeezed Ron's hand tighter, her other hand covering her mouth to stifle a sob. She hadn't spoken since they'd moved him to the room, hadn't let go of his hand, hadn't looked away from his face. Molly watched her with aching sympathy. She recognized that expression, had worn it herself too many times. The look of someone realizing how easily they could lose everything, how fragile happiness truly was, how death could snatch away the people you loved in an instant. "Hermione, dear," Molly said softly, touching the girl's shoulder. "You should rest. There's a cot in the corner." "I'm not leaving him," Hermione said, her voice fierce despite the tears. "I can't. I won't." "Then at least eat something," Molly pressed. You'll be no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. I don't deserve to eat, Hermione whispered, and the self-loathing in her voice made everyone in the room go still. I don't deserve anything. Do you know when I last really talked to him? Really spent time with him? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. We had breakfast together for 30 minutes, and I spent 20 of them reading case files. Hermione, Ginny started, but Hermione shook her head violently. He asked me to postpone our day together, and I said, fine, like it didn't matter, like seeing him wasn't the most important thing in my life, and now he's... Her voice broke. What if he died? What if the last real conversation we'd had was me saying fine in a letter? What if... But he didn't die, Arthur said gently, moving to kneel beside her chair. He's right here, Hermione. He's going to wake up, and you'll have another chance. You'll have thousands of chances. I don't know how to do this, Hermione said, her composure finally shattering completely. I don't know how to be the person who changes the world and the person who's there for him. I don't know how to fight for justice and fight for us. There aren't enough hours. There isn't enough of me, and I'm failing at everything. The words tumbled out in a rush, all the guilt and exhaustion and loneliness she'd been carrying for months. Molly pulled her into a fierce hug, and Hermione clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder the way she hadn't let herself cry in weeks. Oh, my dear girl, Molly murmured. You're not failing. You're just trying to carry too much alone. That's what we do, isn't it? We love someone and we think we have to be perfect for them, have to do everything and be everything. But love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. It's about being honest about what we can and can't do. It's about asking for help. I don't know how to ask for help, Hermione whispered. I've always had to prove I belonged, always had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. How do I stop fighting like that? By remembering that Ron has never asked you to be perfect, George said quietly. He's only ever asked you to be yourself and to occasionally remember that he exists. Despite everything, Hermione let out a wet laugh. I've been terrible at that second part. Yeah, George agreed, but his tone was kind. But so has he. You think he's been present? He's been running between the shop and Auror, training like a madman, trying to be everything to everyone. You're both exhausted. You're both trying too hard. And you're both forgetting that you're supposed to be doing this together, not in parallel. Ron stirred then, just slightly, a soft groan escaping his lips. Everyone fell silent, leaning forward, watching as his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Ron, Hermione breathed, her hand tightening on his. Ron, can you hear me? His eyes found her face, took a moment to focus, and then he smiled. That soft, slightly dopey smile that was pure Ron. Hermione, he rasped, his voice rough from the healing potions. You're here. Of course I'm here, she said, tears streaming down her face. Again. Where else would I be? Dunno, Ron mumbled, still clearly foggy from pain potions and healing spells. Ministry, changing the world, being brilliant. He frowned slightly. Did we postpone Sunday? Can't remember. Hermione laughed and cried at the same time. Sunday is cancelled. All Sundays are cancelled until further notice. I'm staying right here. That's nice, Ron said, his eyes already drifting closed again. Missed you so much. I missed you too, Hermione whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I haven't been here. It's okay, Ron murmured. You were saving the world. Someone's got her. "The world can wait," Hermione said firmly, and meant it. "You can't." Ron's lips curved into another smile before he drifted back to sleep, his breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of healing rest. Hermione held his hand and watched him breathe, and made a promise to herself, to him, to the universe that had somehow let him survive. Things were going to change. She couldn't save the world if she lost herself in the process. She couldn't fight for justice if she sacrificed everything that made life worth living. And she couldn't keep Ron if she was never there to be kept. The Wizengamot hearing was Monday, 4 days away. Hermione looked at Marcus's number on her emergency contact list and made a decision. She'd be at that hearing. She'd give it everything she had. And then she'd step back, delegate, trust others to carry some of the weight. Because Ron was right here, alive and breathing, and hers, and she'd nearly lost him without ever really having him. That wasn't acceptable. That was never going to happen again. Ron woke properly 2 days later, the fog of pain potions finally clearing enough for him to understand where he was and what had happened. The private room at St. Mungo's was filled with flowers, his mother's doing, no doubt, and sunlight streamed through the window, painting everything in shades of gold. And there, curled in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his even in sleep, was Hermione. She looked terrible, Ron thought, with a surge of affection. Her hair was a wild mess, her robes wrinkled from days of wear, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Hermione," he said softly, his voice still rough, but stronger than before. "Hey." Her eyes flew open immediately, alert in the way of someone who'd been sleeping lightly, ready to wake at the slightest change. "Ron," she breathed, sitting up quickly. "You're awake, really awake. How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a cutting curse," Ron said, attempting a grin. "But alive, which is better than the alternative." Hermione's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't," she said fiercely. "Don't joke about it. You nearly died, Ron. You nearly—" She couldn't finish, pressing her free hand to her mouth. Ron squeezed her hand gently. "But I didn't. I'm here. I'm okay." "You threw yourself in front of a curse," Hermione said, her voice shaking with anger now, or fear, or some mixture of both. "For Harry, again. Just like in the war, just like always. You think your life matters less than everyone else's." "Harry's my best mate," Ron interrupted quietly. "And he was about to die. What was I supposed to do?" "Not get yourself killed," Hermione cried, then caught herself, lowering her voice as a healer passed in the corridor outside. "You're supposed to survive, Ron. You're supposed to come home. You're supposed to—" Her voice broke again. "You're supposed to be there for our future, for our life together, for all the things we're supposed to do that we never get around to because we're both so busy trying to save everyone else that we're forgetting to save ourselves." Ron stared at her, seeing past the anger to the fear beneath, the loneliness, the exhaustion that mirrored his own. "You've been thinking," he said, softly. "I've had time to think," Hermione said, wiping at her tears. 2 days of sitting here, watching you sleep, wondering if you'd wake up, wondering if the last meaningful conversation we'd had was going to be about postponing Sunday. And I realized, Ron, we're destroying ourselves. Both of us. We're so busy fighting for this better world that we're not actually living in it. I know, Ron said quietly. And he did. He'd known it for weeks, maybe months. But admitting it felt like failure. Felt like giving up on the promises they'd made to themselves and each other about what they'd do after the war ended. Hermione stood abruptly, pacing to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. I went to the Wizengamot hearing yesterday, she said. The one about the heritage verification statute. Marcus presented the case. I'd prepared everything, given him all my research. And you know what happened? What? Ron asked, watching her silhouette against the bright window. We won, Hermione said, but her voice held no triumph. The statute was overturned, a landmark victory for Muggle-born rights. Marcus said it was brilliant work, said I should be proud. She turned to face him, her expression raw. And all I could think was that I didn't care, that none of it mattered, because you were lying in a hospital bed, and I wasn't there when you woke up the first time. Your mother had to come find me at the ministry at 3 in the morning because I was working instead of sleeping, instead of being anywhere you could reach me. Hermione, Ron started, but she shook her head. No, let me finish, please. She took a shaky breath. I've spent my whole life fighting to prove I belong, to prove I'm good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. And somewhere along the way, I started believing that my worth was measured by how much I could accomplish, how many wrongs I could right, how hard I could work. I forgot that I already belong, that I'm already worthy, that I'm already enough, not because of what I do, but because of who I am. She crossed back to him, kneeling beside the bed so they were eye level. You've never asked me to prove anything, Ron. You've loved me exactly as I am, flaws and bossiness and all. And I've been so busy trying to save the world that I've been failing to show up for the person who matters most. Ron felt his own eyes burning. I haven't exactly been present either, he admitted. Between helping George and Auror training and missions, I kept thinking I had to do it all, had to be everything to everyone, had to prove I deserved to be an Auror, deserved to help George, deserved you. And I was so exhausted trying to juggle everything that I let the most important thing, us, fall through the cracks. So what do we do? Hermione asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. How do we fix this? Ron considered, his mind working through the problem the way he'd learned to work through tactical situations in Auror training. We make different choices, he said slowly. We prioritize differently. We stop trying to do everything and start doing what actually matters. But the work matters, Hermione protested. Reforming the ministry matters. Hunting Death Eaters matters. Helping George matters. It does, Ron agreed. But it doesn't matter more than us. Nothing matters more than us. He took her hand in both of his, ignoring the pull in his injured side. Hermione, what if we decided that our relationship comes first? Not in a selfish way, but in a sustainable way. What if we made time for each other non-negotiable, the way we make Wizengamot hearings and Auror missions non-negotiable? Hermione was quiet for a long moment, and Ron could practically see her brilliant mind working through the implications, the logistics, the ways it could work or fail. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said. Okay, yes. But that means real changes, Ron. Not just promising to do better and then falling back into the same patterns. What kind of changes? Ron asked. Hermione stood, began pacing again, but this time with purpose, with the organizational energy he recognized from 1,000 study sessions and battle plans. I need to delegate more at the ministry. Marcus has been telling me that for weeks. I don't have to personally fight every battle. I can train other advocates, build a team, create sustainable change instead of burning myself out trying to do everything alone. That makes sense, Ron said carefully. And you, Hermione turned to him, her expression serious. You need to choose, Ron. You can't keep splitting yourself between the shop and the Aurors. It's not fair to George. It's not fair to the Auror office. And it's not fair to you. You're trying to be two people, and you're exhausting yourself. Ron felt something tighten in his chest. She was right. He knew she was right. But the thought of choosing felt impossible. George needs me, he said quietly. The shop is doing better, Hermione interrupted gently. Ron, I visited the shop 3 days ago before all this happened. I wanted to see George, to apologize for being so absent. And you know what I saw? The shop was busy, really busy. George was handling it. He was laughing with customers, demonstrating products, being himself again. He's healing, Ron. He's finding his way forward. But without Fred, Ron started. Without Fred, the shop is different, Hermione said. But it's still alive. George is keeping it alive, honoring Fred by continuing what they built together. But Ron, he doesn't need you to be Fred. He needs you to be his brother. And you can be his brother while having your own life, your own career, your own path. Ron absorbed this, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. I wanted to help, he said softly. I wanted to fix it for him. I know, Hermione said, returning to his side. Just like I wanted to fix centuries of injustice, immediately. But we can't fix everything, and we can't do it alone, and we can't sacrifice our lives in the attempt. So what do? Ron asked again, but this time he thought he knew the answer. We choose, Hermione said simply. We choose what matters most, and we build our lives around that. We choose each other, first and always. We choose careers that fulfill us, but don't consume us. We choose to ask for help instead of carrying everything ourselves. The healer came in then, a cheerful witch named Cordelia who'd been managing Ron's care. How's our hero feeling this morning? She asked, checking his charts with a series of diagnostic spells. Like I need to get out of here, Ron said honestly. Cordelia laughed. I imagine so. Well, the good news is that you're healing beautifully. The wound is closing properly, no signs of infection or curse residue. I'd say another 3 days here, then you can go home for bed rest. 2 weeks minimum before any strenuous activity, and no returning to active Auror duty for at least a month. A month? Ron's eyes widened. Be grateful it's not 3, Cordelia said firmly. That was a nasty curse, Mr. Weasley. You're lucky to be alive, and you'll be luckier still if you heal properly and don't rush back too soon. After she left, Ron and Hermione sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, Ron spoke. I think I want to stay with the Aurors, he said slowly. Not field work, maybe. Not the dangerous missions. But training new recruits, maybe. Teaching them what we learned in the war. How to stay alive. How to work as a team. Kingsley mentioned they need instructors. That sounds perfect, Hermione said, her face lighting up. You'd be brilliant at that. And it would be safer, regular hours. Your turn, Ron interrupted. What are you choosing? Hermione took a deep breath. I'm staying with the ministry, with the legal reform work. But I'm going to build a team, hire junior advocates, train them, delegate the research and the grunt work. Focus on the big cases, the landmark decisions, but stop trying to personally overturn every unjust law in the books. And us? Ron asked. What are we choosing for us? Sunday dinners at the Burrow, Hermione said immediately. Non-negotiable. Every week, just us and your family. Wednesday lunches, Ron added. In Diagon Alley. You can visit the shop. We can eat at the Leaky Cauldron. Evenings at home, Hermione continued, warming to the theme. At least 3 nights a week. No work, no emergencies, unless someone's actually dying. A real home, Ron said. Not your tiny flat, not my room at the Burrow. A place that's ours. Hermione smiled, tears glistening in her eyes again, but happy ones this time. A place that's ours, she agreed. The door burst open, and George rushed in, slightly out of breath. Finally, he said. The healer said you were actually conscious and coherent. About time, little brother. George, Ron said, grinning despite the pull in his side. How's the shop? Packed, George said, pulling up a chair. Absolutely mental. Apparently nearly dying makes you a celebrity, and people want to buy their joke products from the brother of a hero Auror. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious as they scanned Ron's face, checking for himself that his brother was truly all right. George, Ron said carefully, I need to talk to you about something. George's expression shifted, became guarded. If this is about the shop. It is, Ron interrupted. I don't think I can keep helping the way I have been. Not full time, not splitting myself between there and the Aurors. George was quiet for a moment, and Ron braced himself for hurt or anger. Instead, his brother smiled, small but genuine. Thank Merlin, George said. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that you don't need to be there anymore, that I can handle it, that I want to handle it, actually. Ron blinked in surprise. Really? Really, George confirmed. Ron, you've been amazing. You helped me remember how to breathe, how to function, how to keep going. But I've been using you as a crutch, and that's not fair to either of us. The shop is Fred and George's legacy, but it's my responsibility now. Mine to run, mine to grow, mine to fill with new ideas and new dreams. I can't do that if I'm leaning on you to be Fred. I could never be Fred, Ron said quietly. No, George agreed. But you're Ron, and that's exactly who I needed for the past few months. My little brother, showing up every day, helping me remember that life goes on, that love continues, that family matters more than grief. He reached over, squeezed Ron's shoulder gently. But now I need you to live your own life. Be an Auror. Be with Hermione. Be happy. That's the best thing you can do for me now. Show me that it's possible to move forward and find joy again. Ron felt his throat tighten with emotion. You're sure? I'm sure, George said firmly. And if I need help, I'll hire someone. Maybe Lee Jordan. He's been asking about coming on board. Or maybe some new kid who wants to learn the trade. But you, little brother, you've done your duty. Time to live your life. After George left, Ron and Hermione sat together in the golden afternoon light, holding hands, feeling the weight of decisions made and futures chosen. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing ever was. There would still be late nights and emergencies, still be struggles and conflicts, and moments when duty called louder than desire. But they had chosen each other, first and always. They had chosen a life together over lives spent in parallel. They had chosen sustainable over spectacular, presence over perfection. And that, dear listener, was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Spring returned to London 6 weeks after Ron's injury, bringing with it the soft green of new leaves and the sweet promise of renewal. Ron stood at the window of the small flat in Diagon Alley, not quite above the shop, but close enough that George could throw chocolate frogs at their window when he wanted company, and watched the morning crowds beginning to fill the cobbled street below. Beside him, Hermione emerged from the bedroom, still tying her ministry robes, her hair damp from the shower. "You're up early," she observed, crossing to him and sliding her arms around his waist from behind, careful of the still healing scar on his side. It had become habit now, this gentleness, this awareness of fragility. Ron didn't mind. It reminded them both how easily they could have lost each other. "Couldn't sleep," Ron admitted, turning in her embrace to face her. "First day as an official Auror instructor. Bit nervous, if I'm honest." Hermione smiled up at him, her eyes warm with pride and affection. "You're going to be brilliant. Those recruits are lucky to have you. Someone who's actually faced real darkness, who knows what it takes to survive. And someone who knows what it costs," Ron added quietly. He thought of the recruits he'd be training today, young witches and wizards barely older than he and Hermione had been when they'd started hunting Horcruxes. He'd teach them defensive spells and tracking charms, yes, but more importantly, he'd teach them to protect each other, to recognize when duty was asking too much, to understand that surviving wasn't just about staying alive. "Speaking of costs," Hermione said, pulling back slightly to look at him properly, "I have news. Good news, I think. Maybe nervous-making news." "Tell me," Ron said, guiding her to the small kitchen table where breakfast was already laid out. Toast and jam, tea that stayed perpetually warm thanks to a household charm, the morning edition of the Daily Prophet that neither of them had read yet. Hermione sat, fidgeting with her teacup in a way that was utterly endearing. "Marcus called me into his office yesterday. The department head wants to create a new position. Senior Advocate for Equality and Reform. Someone to oversee the entire equality initiative, build and manage a team, set strategic priorities." She paused, watching Ron's face. "They want me to take it." Ron felt pride bloom warm in his chest. "Hermione, that's incredible. You'd be perfect for it." "It's more responsibility," Hermione said carefully, "but also more authority to delegate. I'd be managing others instead of doing everything myself, setting direction rather than drowning in research. It's what I've been working toward, but..." She bit her lip. "It would mean longer hours sometimes. Important meetings, travel to other magical governments to study their systems. I'd still have evenings and weekends, still have our time together. But Ron, I need to know if you're okay with this. Really okay. Not just saying you are because you think you should." Ron took her hand, threading their fingers together, looking at this brilliant woman who still sometimes doubted that she could have both, could be extraordinary and loved, could change the world and come home to him. "I'm really okay with it," he said firmly. "Hermione, you're meant for this. You're going to transform the entire magical legal system, make it fair and just for everyone. And I'll be here, teaching recruits and having Wednesday lunches with you, and making sure you actually eat dinner instead of surviving on tea and determination. Hermione's eyes filled with tears, the happy kind, the grateful kind. "We're really doing this," she said wonderingly. "We're actually building a life together. A real life, not just surviving." "We are," Ron agreed, and kissed her softly, tasting tea and toast and the future they were choosing together. After breakfast, they went their separate ways. Hermione to the ministry for her meeting with the department head, Ron to the Auror training facility in the lower levels. But they'd meet for lunch at 1 o'clock at the small cafe near the leaky cauldron that had become their Wednesday tradition. And tonight, they'd have dinner at home, just the two of them, continuing the rhythm they'd established over the past 6 weeks of recovery and rebuilding. Ron's first class of recruits stood at attention in the training room, 12 young faces filled with eagerness and nerves and the kind of idealism that war hadn't yet touched. Ron recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once, before he'd learned what darkness really meant. "Right," Ron said, moving to stand before them, feeling oddly comfortable in this teaching role despite his nerves. "I'm Ron Weasley, and I'll be your instructor in practical defensive magic and field operations. Some of you probably know who I am. Fought in the war, helped destroy Horcruxes, all that. But I'm not here to talk about my heroics. I'm here to make sure you lot survive long enough to have your own stories." He spent the morning teaching them shield charms. Not the theoretical kind from textbooks, but the instinctive, life-saving kind that you could cast while dodging curses and protecting your partner. He taught them to fight as a unit, to watch each other's backs, to understand that the strongest magic was trust. During a break, one of the recruits, a young woman named Patricia Vance, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Weasley, can I ask you something?" "It's just Ron," he said, taking a swig of water. "And yeah, ask away." "How do you know when to stop fighting?" Patricia asked quietly. "Everyone says we're at peace now, that the war is over. But there are still Death Eaters out there, still dark wizards to catch. How do you know when you've done enough, when you can just live?" Ron looked at her, seeing himself in the question, seeing Hermione, seeing everyone who'd survived the war and struggled with the aftermath. "You don't stop fighting," he said slowly. "Not completely. There's always going to be darkness to face, injustice to correct, people who need protecting. But you learn to fight sustainably. You learn that you can't pour from an empty cup, can't save anyone if you destroy yourself in the process." He gestured to his side, where the scar still pulled sometimes. "I nearly died 6 weeks ago because I'd been running myself ragged, splitting my attention between too many things, too exhausted to think straight. And you know what I learned? The world doesn't need dead heroes. It needs living people who show up, do their part, and go home to the people they love. It needs sustainable courage, not spectacular burnout." Patricia nodded slowly, absorbing this. "So how do you do it? Balance duty and life?" "You choose," Ron said simply. "Every day, you make conscious choices about what matters most. Some days, duty calls louder. Some days, life does. But you never lose sight of why you're fighting in the first place, to protect a world worth living in. And you can't protect that if you're not actually living in it yourself." The afternoon found Ron at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, stopping by after training as had become his habit. The shop was bustling, filled with the sound of children's laughter and the occasional small explosion from a demonstration gone slightly wrong. George stood behind the counter, his face animated as he explained the finer points of the new portable swamp to an interested customer. "Ron," George called out, spotting him. "Perfect timing. Come test this new product Lee and I developed." Lee Jordan had indeed joined the shop, bringing his own brand of creative chaos to complement George's inventive genius. Together, they were creating products that honored Fred's memory while pushing the shop in new directions. Ron had watched George slowly come alive again over the past weeks, watched him find joy in creation, watched him learn to laugh without the laughter being shadowed by grief. "What is it?" Ron asked, eyeing the small purple sphere George held out suspiciously. "Mood mist," George explained. "You throw it, and it creates a cloud that reflects everyone's emotional state in colors. We're marketing it for parties, team-building exercises, that sort of thing. But we need to test if it actually works." Ron took the sphere and tossed it gently to the floor. It burst in a shimmer of light, and suddenly the shop was filled with swirling colors, golds and warm oranges and soft pinks, with the occasional streak of blue or gray threading through. "Brilliant," Lee exclaimed. "Look at that. Mostly happy colors. People are enjoying themselves. That's exactly what we wanted." George was watching the colors with an expression Ron couldn't quite read. "There," he said softly, pointing to a corner where the mist swirled in a complex pattern of purple and gold, shot through with silver. "That's where I'm standing. Purple for grief, gold for joy, silver for remembering." Ron moved to stand beside his brother, watching the colors shift and blend around them. "All three at once," he observed. "All three at once," George agreed. "Turns out you can be sad and happy simultaneously, grieving and grateful, missing someone and still moving forward." He turned to Ron, his expression open and honest in a way it hadn't been since before Fred died. "Thank you, Ron, for helping me get here, for showing up when I couldn't face any of it alone." "Always," Ron said simply. "That's what brothers do." "And now you're doing your own thing," George continued, "teaching Aurors, building a life with Hermione. I'm proud of you, little brother. Fred would be too." The mention of Fred still hurt, would probably always hurt, but it was a softer hurt now, more memory than wound. "Yeah," Ron said quietly. "I think he would be." Wednesday lunch with Hermione had become Ron's favorite part of the week. They met at the cafe, ordered the same thing they always ordered, shepherd's pie for Ron, vegetable soup for Hermione, and talked about everything and nothing: work, family, plans for the weekend, the book Hermione was reading, the recruit who'd accidentally set his own robes on fire during training. "I accepted the position," Hermione said, smiling over her soup. "Senior Advocate for Equality and Reform. I start next month." "That's brilliant," Ron said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," Hermione admitted. "Excited, determined. Like I'm finally doing what I'm meant to do, but in a way that doesn't require me to sacrifice everything else." She squeezed his hand. "I hired my first junior advocate today, a young muggle-born wizard named David Chen, fresh out of Hogwarts. Brilliant legal mind. Reminds me of myself, actually. Full of fire and determination to change everything immediately." "What did you tell him?" Ron asked, curious. "I told him that changing the world is a marathon, not a sprint," Hermione said, echoing the words Marcus had told her months ago. "That he needs to pace himself, build sustainable habits, remember to live, his life while fighting for justice. And then I gave him the heritage verification case files and told him to find 3 more precedents to strengthen our position. Ron laughed. So basically, do as I say, not as I did. Basically, Hermione agreed, grinning. But I'm trying, Ron, really trying to practice what I preach. I left the office at 6 yesterday. 6? Do you know how revolutionary that is for me? What did you do with all that extra time? Ron teased. I went to the bookshop, Hermione said, her eyes sparkling. Bought 3 new books, for pleasure, not work. Then I came home and actually read one while you were at training. It was lovely, decadent, completely impractical, and absolutely necessary. This was the rhythm they'd found, dear listener. Work that fulfilled them, but didn't consume them. Time together that was protected and sacred. Separate lives that supported rather than competed with each other. It wasn't perfect. There were still late nights when duty called, still moments of friction when schedules conflicted, still the occasional argument about priorities or misunderstandings about expectations. But they'd learned to talk about it, to adjust, to forgive each other and themselves for being imperfect humans trying their best. The weeks turned into months, and spring gave way to summer. Ron's training classes graduated their first cohort of recruits, young Aurors who went into the field with better preparation and more realistic expectations than any class before them. Hermione's team of advocates successfully overturned 3 more discriminatory laws and began drafting comprehensive equality legislation that would reshape magical society for generations. And on a warm Saturday in July, Ron and Hermione were married. The wedding was held at the Burrow, in the garden where gnomes had been temporarily relocated and where white chairs sat arranged before an archway woven with flowers. It was small, intimate, just family and close, friends, the people who'd stood beside them through war and its aftermath, who'd watched them struggle and grow and finally find their balance. Hermione walked down the makeshift aisle on Harry's arm, her white robes simple but elegant, her hair tamed into soft curls, her face radiant with joy. Ron stood at the altar with George beside him as best man, and when he saw her, felt his throat close with emotion. This brilliant, beautiful woman had chosen him, had chosen their life together, with all its ordinary days and quiet evenings and Wednesday lunches. You look beautiful, Ron whispered as she reached him. You look terrified, Hermione whispered back, smiling. Bit of both, Ron admitted, and they shared a soft laugh before turning to face the officiant. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but heartfelt. When it came time for Ron to speak his promises, he looked into Hermione's eyes and said the words that mattered most. I promise to show up, to be present, to make time, to choose you first and always. I promise to build a life with you, not just survive alongside you. I promise to remember that the world we're fighting for includes us, includes this, includes the right to be happy and together and simply alive. Hermione's vows were equally simple, equally profound. I promise to trust you with my heart and my vulnerabilities, to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone, to remember that being enough for you doesn't require being perfect. I promise to build a life that honors both who we are and what we believe in, to fight for justice without losing myself, to love you with the same fierce determination I bring to everything else. When they kissed, the garden erupted in cheers and applause. Magic swirled around them, conjured butterflies from Ginny, shimmering light from Luna, a shower of golden sparks from George that resolved into the shape of a phoenix, Fred's favorite magical creature. The reception was pure Weasley chaos. Too much food, too much laughter, too many relatives trying to give advice or tell embarrassing stories. George and Lee had created a special line of wedding products that kept appearing throughout the evening. Confetti that sang in harmony, champagne that changed flavors with each sip, dancing lights that moved in time to the music. As the sun set and the party continued, Ron and Hermione slipped away to the edge of the garden, to the pond where they'd sat so many times during the war and after, making plans and promises and trying to imagine a future that seemed impossible. "We did it," Hermione said softly, leaning against Ron's shoulder. "We actually made it here." "We did," Ron agreed, his arm around her waist. "And it's better than I imagined. All of it, the teaching, your work at the ministry, the flat, the life we're building. It's not dramatic or spectacular, but it's ours. It's real." "It's enough," Hermione said, and the words held all the understanding they'd fought so hard to reach. More than enough. They stood together in the gathering twilight, watching their family celebrate, hearing George's laughter ring out clear and genuine, seeing Harry dancing with Ginny, watching Bill spin little Victoire in circles while Fleur laughed. This was what they'd fought for, Ron realized. Not glory or recognition or even justice, though justice mattered. They'd fought for this, for ordinary moments of extraordinary love, for the right to build lives worth living, for Wednesday lunches and Sunday dinners and quiet evenings at home, for the chance to heal and grow and become more than just survivors of war. The months stretched into years, dear listener, and Ron and Hermione's life unfolded with quiet purpose and deliberate joy. Ron became one of the Auror office's most respected instructors, known for producing recruits who were not just skilled, but balanced, who understood that protecting others began with protecting yourself. Hermione rose through the ministry, ranks, eventually becoming deputy head of the Department of Magical Law, overseeing reforms that would be studied and celebrated for generations. George's shop thrived, expanding to a second location in Hogsmeade, with Lee as full partner. The grief never completely faded, but it became part of the shop's story, part of its magic, a memorial to Fred built not in stone, but in laughter, in joy, in products that brought light to a world that had seen too much darkness. And through it all, Ron and Hermione kept their promises to each other. Wednesday lunches, even when Hermione became too important to take midweek breaks, she took them anyway. Sunday dinners at the Burrow, even when Ron's training schedule was intense, he made time anyway. Evenings at home, talking and reading and simply being together, even when the world tried to pull them in different directions, they pulled back together. They learned that love wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It was about showing up day after day, choosing each other in small ways and large. It was about sustainable courage, about building a life that could weather storms because its foundation was solid, was honest, was enough. Years later, when young Aurors asked Ron how he'd become a war hero, he'd smile and correct them gently. "I was just someone who fought beside real heroes," he'd say. "But I'll tell you what I'm most proud of. I learned to live as bravely as I fought. I learned that coming home is as important as going into battle. I learned that the people who love you deserve your presence as much as the world deserves your courage. And when young advocates asked Hermione how she'd change the magical world, she'd share her victories and legislation, yes, but she'd also talk about balance, about teams, about the importance of sustainable activism. You can't fight for justice if you're too exhausted to think clearly, she'd say. You can't change the world if you're not actually living in it. Do the work, fight the fights that matter, but remember that taking care of yourself and your relationships isn't selfish, it's essential. Their legacy, dear listener, was not just in the Death Eaters captured or the laws changed, though those mattered greatly. Their legacy was in proving that heroes could choose ordinary happiness, that warriors could also choose peace, that surviving a war meant more than just staying alive. It meant learning to truly live. And live they did, dear listener. They lived fully and deliberately, with purpose and joy, with work that mattered and love that sustained, with Wednesday lunches and Sunday dinners, and all the small, precious moments that make a life worth fighting for. They lived and loved and were happy, and that perhaps was the greatest magic of all. And so our tale comes to its gentle close, dear listener. As you drift towards sleep, let your heart rest easy, knowing that Ron and Hermione found their way not to perfection, but to something better, to a life built on truth and balance, on love chosen daily, on the courage to be ordinary after being extraordinary. May you, too, find that balance in your own life. May you remember that showing up matters as much as standing out, that presence is as precious as achievement, that love, quiet, daily, chosen love, is the truest magic we possess. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep peacefully. And wake tomorrow ready to build your own life worth living. One brave, ordinary, beautiful day at a time.